The cabin service went perfectly until 37,000 feet, when Captain Morrison's condescending remark about flight attendants knowing their place was interrupted by the sound every pilot fears most, the sudden silence of failing engines. As Flight 447 began its terrifying descent toward the Atlantic, Lysandra Thane calmly removed her service apron and walked toward the cockpit. What happened next would be talked about in aviation circles for decades, and Captain Morrison would never again dismiss anyone as just a flight attendant. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories about hidden expertise and split-second heroism, please subscribe for more tales of extraordinary people in ordinary disguise. The morning briefing had gone exactly as Lysandra Thane expected it would. She sat in the back row of the crew meeting room at JFK International, her flight attendant uniform crisp and professional, her auburn hair pulled into the regulation style that had become second nature after 18 months of playing this role. Captain Derek Morrison dominated the front of the room with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never doubted his own importance. At 52, he was the kind of pilot who wore his authority like an expensive watch, constantly visible and designed to impress. His co-pilot, First Officer Sarah Chen, sat beside him with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate Morrison's ego without triggering it. "Today's flight to London should be routine," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the particular tone of condescension that Lysandra had observed in certain pilots who confused rank with competence. "Weather's clear, no mechanical issues, and we've got an experienced crew." His eyes swept over the 5 flight attendants, pausing briefly on Lysandra with the dismissive glance he gave to all service personnel. In the 18 months she'd been working these flights, Morrison had never bothered to learn her name. To him, she was just another interchangeable uniform, if only he knew. "Flight attendants," Morrison continued, "I expect you to keep the cabin service smooth and efficient. No unnecessary interruptions to the flight deck. We'll be busy with real aviation work." Lysandra bit back the response that came naturally, that she'd logged more flight hours than Morrison had, in aircraft he'd never be qualified to touch. Instead, she nodded along with the other attendants, maintaining the facade she'd perfected over the past year and a half. Her cover was simple and effective. Lysandra Thane, former marketing executive who'd changed careers after a divorce, looking for adventure and travel opportunities. Her resume showed customer service experience and basic safety training. It made no mention of her 15 years as a test pilot for experimental aircraft, her certification in 12 different aircraft types, or the classified missions she'd flown for 3 different intelligence agencies. The transformation had been necessary after her last assignment, a deep cover operation that had ended with her being declared dead in a plane crash over the Pacific. The woman who'd walked away from that wreckage had needed a new identity, a new life, and a new purpose. Becoming a flight attendant had seemed like the perfect cover. She could stay close to aviation while remaining completely invisible to anyone looking for a pilot with her particular skills. For 18 months it had worked perfectly. Until today. Flight 447 pushed back from the gate at 10:15 a.m., exactly on schedule. Lysandra performed the safety demonstration with the same professional competence she brought to every flight, pointing out exits and life vests, while mentally noting that the aircraft, a Boeing 777-300ER, was showing subtle signs of maintenance deferrals that would be invisible to passengers, but concerning to anyone with her level of technical knowledge. The hydraulic pressure gauge in the galley showed readings that were within legal limits, but at the low end of the normal range. The slight vibration in the cabin floor suggested possible engine mount issues. The way the aircraft had felt during taxi indicated that the nose-wheel steering was probably due for replacement. None of these issues were immediately dangerous, but they were the kind of cumulative maintenance problems that could cascade into something serious under the wrong circumstances. As they reached cruising altitude, Lysandra began the beverage service, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She knew exactly which passengers would want coffee, which would ask for extra napkins, and which would require special attention. Flight attendant work had turned out to be surprisingly similar to intelligence gathering. It was all about observing details and managing human psychology. "Excuse me, miss." The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Wells, a passenger in 12C who'd been studying technical manuals for the entire flight. "I'm curious about something. Those vibrations we've been feeling, they seem to be getting stronger." Lysandra paused, her trained ear confirming what Dr. Wells had noticed. The vibrations were indeed increasing, and they were centered around the engine mounts. "I'll check with the captain," Lysandra said reassuringly. "Sometimes these older aircraft have little quirks." She made her way to the front of the cabin and knocked on the cockpit door. After the required verification process, First Officer Chen opened it with a polite smile. "What can we do for you?" Chen asked. "I've had a passenger comment about increased vibrations," Lysandra said. "I wanted to make sure everything's normal." Captain Morrison looked up from his newspaper with obvious irritation. "The aircraft is flying perfectly fine. Tell your passenger that if they want to pilot the plane, they can go to flight school." "Yes, sir. I just thought you should know." "What you should know," Morrison interrupted, "is that flight attendants handle passenger service and pilots handle flying. Stay in your lane." Lysandra felt the familiar surge of anger that came with being dismissed by someone who was demonstrably less qualified than she was. But she maintained her professional demeanour. "Of course, Captain. I'll reassure the passenger." As she turned to leave, she caught First Officer Chen's eye. Chen's expression was apologetic, but there was something else there. A flicker of concern that suggested she'd noticed the vibrations too. Lysandra returned to the cabin and continued her service, but her attention was now focused on the aircraft's behaviour. The vibrations were definitely getting worse, and they were accompanied by a subtle change in engine sound that would be imperceptible to most people, but unmistakable to a pilot with her experience. 45 minutes later, her suspicions were confirmed in the most dramatic way possible. She was serving drinks in the business class section when it happened. The sudden, terrifying silence that every pilot knows means catastrophic engine failure. The aircraft lurched violently to the left as the number 1 engine failed completely, followed 3 seconds later by a similar failure in the number 2 engine. Total engine failure, at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. In the cockpit, alarms were screaming. Passengers began to panic as the aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent. The oxygen masks deployed automatically, and the cabin filled with the terrifying sound of wind rushing past a powerless aircraft. Lysandra felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had served her well in countless emergency situations. Time seemed to slow down as her training took over. She moved through the cabin with calm efficiency, helping passengers with their oxygen masks, while her mind ran through emergency procedures that most commercial pilots had never even studied. Dual-engine failure in a 777 was supposed to be virtually impossible. The fact that it had happened suggested either catastrophic mechanical failure or something more sinister. Through the cabin windows, she could see the ocean growing larger at an alarming rate. The aircraft was descending too fast, much faster than it should be even in a dual-engine failure scenario. She made a decision that would have shocked Captain Morrison if he'd been in any condition to be shocked by anything other than his own impending death. Lysandra walked to the front of the cabin and knocked on the cockpit door with a specific pattern: 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. It was a code known only to intelligence operatives and certain test pilots, and it meant emergency assistance available. First Officer Chen opened the door, her face pale with terror and professional concentration. "We need help," Chen said without preamble. "Dual-engine failure and the captain's having chest pains. I think it's a heart attack." Lysandra looked past Chen to see Captain Morrison slumped in his seat, conscious but clearly in medical distress. The aircraft was in a steep descent, and Chen was struggling with controls that weren't responding normally. "I'm a pilot," Lysandra said simply. Chen blinked. "What?" "I'm a qualified pilot, multi-engine, instrument-rated, and I've flown 777s before. Let me help." There was no time for explanations or verification. The aircraft was falling out of the sky, and standard procedures clearly weren't working. Thank God, Chen breathed, stepping aside to let Lysandra into the cockpit. Lysandra slipped into the captain's seat, her hands moving automatically to the controls. The muscle memory was instant. Thousands of hours of flight training kicked in as she assessed the situation with the cold precision of someone who'd faced death in aircraft before. Both engines were completely dead, but that wasn't the worst problem. The aircraft's flight control systems were behaving erratically, suggesting damage beyond simple engine failure. The hydraulic systems were failing, the electrical systems were fluctuating, and the aircraft was descending far too rapidly. What happened? She asked Chen while her hands worked the controls with practiced precision. I don't know. Everything was normal, and then both engines just quit. Captain Morrison started grabbing his chest about 30 seconds later. Lysandra's mind raced through possibilities. Dual-engine failure was virtually impossible unless there was fuel contamination, massive bird strike, or deliberate sabotage. Given the additional system failures, sabotage was looking increasingly likely. But that was a problem for later. Right now, she had to save 300 lives with a crippled aircraft at 37,000 feet. I'm declaring an emergency, she told Chen. Get me ATC on all frequencies. Mayday, 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 Lysandra transmitted. This is Transatlantic Flight 447, dual-engine failure, requesting immediate assistance and emergency vectors to nearest suitable airport. The response came immediately. Flight 447, this is Gander Control. Confirmed dual-engine failure? Confirmed. Both engines failed simultaneously at 37,000 feet. We have additional system failures and are currently in uncontrolled descent. Requesting immediate clearance to... She checked their position and calculated rapidly. We need Keflavik, Iceland. It's our only option. Flight 447. Keflavik is 280 miles northeast. Turn heading 045, descend to 10,000 feet. Lysandra almost laughed. Descend to 10,000 feet was exactly what they were doing, whether they wanted to or not. Unable to maintain controlled descent, she transmitted. Aircraft is not responding normally to controls. We're coming down fast. What she didn't say over the radio was that they probably wouldn't make it to Iceland. The aircraft was losing altitude at nearly 6,000 feet per minute, and with the control problems they were experiencing, a water landing was looking more and more likely. But Lysandra had experience with situations that other pilots would consider hopeless. Sarah, she said to First Officer Chen, I need you to go back and prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Water landing procedures. Get the senior flight attendant. What's her name? Jennifer Walsh. Get Jennifer and tell her to prepare for ditching. Life vests, emergency exits, brace positions, and tell her that the pilot is handling the aircraft, but don't tell anyone about the captain's condition. We don't need panic. Chen nodded and headed back to the cabin. Lysandra was now alone with an unconscious captain and an aircraft that was falling out of the sky at a rate that would put them in the Atlantic Ocean in approximately 12 minutes. She began working through procedures that weren't in any commercial pilot's manual. Techniques she'd learned flying experimental aircraft, methods for controlling damaged planes that she'd developed during classified test programs. The first thing was to stop the uncontrolled descent. With no engine power and limited hydraulic authority, she needed to use every trick she knew about aerodynamics and aircraft physics. She adjusted the aircraft's configuration, using the remaining control surfaces to create a more stable flight profile. The rate of descent slowed from 6,000 feet per minute to 4,000. Still too fast, but manageable. Next, she began troubleshooting the engine failures. The instruments were telling her that both engines had quit completely, but her experience suggested that might not be the whole truth. Engine failures, this catastrophic, usually left some indications of mechanical damage, metal fragments, oil pressure loss, or fire warnings. She was seeing none of those signs, which meant the engines weren't mechanically damaged. They were being prevented from running by something else. Fuel contamination was possible, but unlikely to affect both engines simultaneously. Computer malfunction could cause this, but the 777's systems were designed with multiple redundancies. That left sabotage. Someone had deliberately caused both engines to shut down, probably through the aircraft's computer systems. which meant that if she could bypass or reset those systems, she might be able to restart the engines. But first, she had to keep them alive long enough to try. At 15,000 feet, she tried the emergency restart procedures. Nothing happened. The engines remained completely dead, their instruments showing normal readings except for the lack of power. At 12,000 feet, she began preparing for what aviation called the impossible turn, a water landing in an aircraft not designed for it. At 8,000 feet, she had an idea. The sabotage, if that's what it was, had probably been designed to simulate catastrophic engine failure. But the saboteurs might not have understood the 777 systems well enough to account for every backup and emergency procedure. She reached under the captain's seat and found the manual flight control disconnect, a lever that most commercial pilots never touched, but that test pilots knew could sometimes restore control in extreme emergencies. She pulled the lever. Suddenly, the aircraft's handling changed dramatically. The descent rate dropped to 2,000 feet per minute, and the control surfaces became more responsive. At 5,000 feet, she tried the engine restart procedures again. The number 2 engine coughed, sputtered, and roared back to life. 30 seconds later, the number 1 engine followed. The aircraft was flying again. Lysandra leveled off at 3,000 feet, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline as she realized how close they'd come to disaster. Around her, the cockpit alarms were finally silencing themselves as systems came back online. "Flight 447, this is Keflavik Tower," came over the radio. "We show you at 3,000 feet with engines running. Confirm your status." "Keflavik Tower, Flight 447, Lysandra transmitted. "We have restored engine power and are maintaining level flight. Requesting priority landing, runway 01. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit and need immediate medical assistance on the ground. Flight 447, cleared for immediate approach runway 1. Emergency equipment is standing by." As she began the approach to Keflavik, First Officer Chen returned to the cockpit with a stunned expression. "The passengers are asking who's flying the plane," Chen said. "They heard a woman's voice on the PA, but they know Captain Morrison is male." "Tell them the truth," Lysandra said as she lined up for final approach. "The flight attendant is flying the plane." The landing was perfect, smooth, controlled, and exactly on center line. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, emergency vehicles surrounded them, and paramedics rushed aboard to tend to Captain Morrison. Lysandra remained in the captain's seat until the engines were shut down and all passengers had been safely evacuated. Only then did she allow herself to think about what had just happened. She'd blown her cover completely. There was no way to explain how a flight attendant had been able to save an aircraft that experienced pilots would have considered doomed. But 300 people were alive because of her actions. That seemed like a fair trade. As the last passenger left the aircraft, First Officer Chen turned to her with an expression of awe and confusion. "Who are you really?" Chen asked. Lysandra removed her flight attendant wings and set them on the instrument panel. "Someone who used to fly planes like this for a living, before I decided to disappear." "Why did you become a flight attendant?" "Because sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, and because I wanted to see if commercial aviation was as safe as everyone claimed it was." Chen processed this. "And what did you find?" "That most of the time it is, but when it's not, you need people who know how to handle the impossible." 2 hours later, Lysandra sat in the Keflavik Airport security office, being debriefed by investigators from 3 different agencies. Her cover was completely blown. There was no explanation for her actions that didn't involve revealing her true qualifications. The investigation would eventually reveal that Flight 447 had been the target of a sophisticated cyber attack designed to cause dual-engine failure over the ocean, where survival would be impossible. The attack had been traced to a terrorist organization that had infiltrated the aircraft's maintenance computers. Captain Morrison survived his heart attack and made a full recovery. He also submitted a formal recommendation that Lysandra be hired immediately as a commercial pilot, with a personal note admitting that he'd been wrong to dismiss her abilities. First Officer Chen requested Lysandra as her permanent captain. and Dr. Patricia Wells, the passenger who'd first noticed the vibrations, turned out to be an aeronautical engineer who'd published a paper titled "The Importance of Cross-Training Flight Crew in Emergency Procedures." 6 months later, Captain Lysandra Thane walked through the same crew briefing room at JFK, but this time she was wearing 4 stripes on her uniform and sitting at the front of the room. "Today's flight to London should be routine," she told her crew, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned her authority the hard way. "Weather's clear, mechanical inspection complete, and we've got an experienced crew." Her first officer was Sarah Chen, who'd requested to fly with her permanently. Her senior flight attendant was Jennifer Walsh, who'd handled the emergency evacuation with exceptional professionalism. "Flight attendants," Lysandra continued, "you are the eyes and ears of this aircraft. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, I want to hear about it immediately. You're not just serving passengers, you're part of the safety team that keeps this aircraft flying." She paused, remembering Captain Morrison's condescending dismissal 18 months earlier. "Every member of this crew has valuable experience and insights. I don't care if you're a pilot, flight attendant, or ground crew. If you see something that doesn't look right, speak up. Lives depend on all of us working together." The flight attendants nodded with a respect that had been earned, not demanded. They all knew the story, how their new captain had spent 18 months working alongside them, how she'd saved 300 lives while wearing their uniform, how she'd proven that expertise could come from the most unexpected places. "Any questions?" Lysandra asked. Jennifer Walsh raised her hand. "Captain, will you be joining us for the crew meal service today?" Lysandra smiled. "Absolutely. Old habits die hard." As the crew dispersed to prepare for boarding, First Officer Chen approached with the pre-flight paperwork. "Still feels strange, doesn't it?" Chen said. "Having you up front instead of in the back." "Sometimes," Lysandra admitted, "but this feels right. Both jobs were important, but this one lets me use all of my skills instead of hiding them." "Do you ever regret blowing your cover?" Lysandra considered the question as she reviewed the maintenance logs, the same logs she'd been secretly analysing for 18 months while pretending to serve coffee. "No," she said finally. "I spent 18 months watching how this industry really works, from the ground up. I learned things about passenger psychology, crew dynamics, and operational procedures that no flight training program could have taught me. That experience makes me a better pilot now." "And the passengers on Flight 447? They went home to their families. That's all that matters." 2 hours later, Flight 201 pushed back from the gate at JFK, bound for London Heathrow. Captain Lysandra Thane was at the controls, with First Officer Chen beside her and a crew that had learned to value expertise over appearance. During the beverage service, Lysandra left the cockpit to walk through the cabin, something she'd started doing on every flight. Passengers were initially surprised to see the captain serving drinks and chatting with travellers, but they quickly adapted to her unconventional style. "Excuse me, Captain," said a passenger in seat 14A. "I wanted to thank you for what you did on that flight to Iceland. My sister was on board." "Just doing my job," Lysandra replied. "No," the passenger said seriously. "You went far beyond your job. You saved her life." As Lysandra returned to the cockpit, she reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. She'd started as a test pilot, become a covert operative, gone into hiding as a flight attendant, and emerged as a commercial airline captain with experiences that few pilots could imagine. Each role had taught her something valuable. Test flying had given her technical expertise and the ability to handle aircraft at their limits. Intelligence work had taught her to observe, analyse, and make decisions under extreme pressure. Working as a flight attendant had shown her the human side of aviation, the families, dreams, and everyday lives that depended on safe flights. "Captain," Chen said as they reached cruising altitude, "we're getting some unusual readings on the number 2 engine. Nothing critical, but worth monitoring." "Thank you," Lysandra said, checking the instruments. The readings were indeed unusual, not dangerous, but the kind of subtle anomaly that could develop into something serious if ignored. "Let's run a full diagnostic," she decided, "and I want maintenance to give it a thorough inspection when we land." Chen nodded and began the diagnostic procedures. As she worked, she said, "You know, before Flight 447, I probably would have just noted this in the log and let the next crew deal with it." "What changed?" "You did. You showed me that small problems can become big problems very quickly, and that the best pilots are the ones who pay attention to details that other people miss." The diagnostic revealed a minor fuel flow irregularity that was easily corrected. But Lysandra made a mental note to ensure that the engine received extra attention during its next scheduled maintenance. As they began their descent into London, Lysandra thought about Captain Morrison, who had returned to flying after his recovery. He'd requested a meeting with her before her first flight as captain, an encounter she'd expected to be awkward. Instead, Morrison had offered a sincere apology and a piece of advice. "I spent 20 years thinking I knew everything about flying. You taught me that the most dangerous thing a pilot can have is an ego that prevents them from learning." He'd paused, then added, "I also learned that the people we work with every day might surprise us if we take the time to really see them." Now, as Flight 201 touched down smoothly at Heathrow, Lysandra felt the satisfaction that came from a job well done. The passengers disembarked safely, the crew had worked together seamlessly, and she'd used every skill she'd learned in her unusual career path. After the post-flight briefing, Jennifer Walsh approached her with a question that had become routine. "Captain, we've got a new flight attendant starting next week. Any advice for training her?" "Same advice I always give," Lysandra said. "Teach her that everyone on this aircraft matters. Passengers, crew, ground staff. We're all part of the same team, and remind her that you never know who might be sitting next to you." "Speaking from experience?" Jennifer asked with a smile. "Always." That evening, Lysandra sat in her London hotel room, reviewing the day's flight logs and preparing for the return journey to New York. Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number, a communication method she'd thought was buried in her past. The message was simple. "Phoenix, we have a situation that requires your unique qualifications. Interested in one more mission?" Lysandra stared at the message for a long time. Phoenix had been her code name during her intelligence years, a name associated with operations she'd thought were finished forever. Apparently, some people still knew how to find her. She thought about her new life as a commercial pilot, the crew that trusted her, the passengers who depended on her skills. She'd found a place where she could use her abilities openly, where she didn't have to hide who she was or what she could do. But she also remembered the lesson she'd learned on Flight 447. Sometimes the world needed people with unusual skills to step forward when others couldn't. She typed back, "What kind of situation?" The response came immediately. The kind that requires someone who can fly anything, anywhere, under any conditions. And who knows how to disappear when the mission is over. Lysandra smiled and typed her final response. "Send me the details, but this time I'm bringing my own crew." Some people spent their careers in a single role, becoming experts in one narrow field. But Lysandra had learned that the most valuable people were often those who could adapt, who could see connections between different skills and experiences, who could surprise everyone, including themselves. She'd been a test pilot, a spy, a flight attendant, and now a commercial captain. Each role had prepared her for the next, and all of them together had made her uniquely qualified for whatever came next. Outside her hotel window, aircraft moved across the Heathrow skyline, carrying thousands of passengers to destinations around the world. Each flight represented countless individual stories, business trips, family reunions, adventures, and homecomings. Most of those flights would be routine, handled by competent crews using standard procedures. But sometimes, when routine wasn't enough, the world needed people who'd learned to be extraordinary while appearing perfectly ordinary. People like the flight attendant who could save a falling aircraft, or the captain who'd learned that the most important qualification wasn't what was written on your resume, but what you were willing to do when everything went wrong. As she prepared for sleep, Lysandra thought about the passengers on Flight 447, now scattered across the globe, probably unaware that they owed their lives to someone who'd spent 18 months serving them coffee while hiding skills that had taken years to develop. Tomorrow she'd captain another flight, work with another crew, and ensure that another group of passengers reached their destinations safely. It was ordinary work made extraordinary by the knowledge that every flight mattered, every passenger was someone's family, and every landing was a small victory against the forces that could go wrong at 37,000 feet. But tonight she was also considering whether Phoenix needed to rise one more time, for one more mission that only she could handle. Some people retired from their first careers and chose something completely different. Lysandra had discovered that her careers weren't separate at all. They were all part of the same continuous mission to keep people safe, whether they knew they needed protection or not. The encrypted phone buzzed again. Mission briefing tomorrow, 1400 hours, coordinates attached. Come alone. Lysandra looked at the message, then at her commercial pilot's uniform hanging in the hotel closet. 2 different lives, 2 different identities, but the same fundamental purpose. She typed back, "I'll be there, but I'm not coming alone anymore. If you want Phoenix, you get the whole crew." The response took longer this time. Unconventional. Explain. Phoenix works alone. Captain Thane works with a team. You can have one or the other, but not both. Another long pause, then. Understood. Bring your team. This mission is bigger than we initially thought. Lysandra smiled and set the phone aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and probably new ways to surprise people who thought they had her figured out. But tonight, she fell asleep thinking about First Officer Chen's steady competence, Jennifer Walsh's unflappable professionalism, and the dozens of other aviation professionals who'd taught her that the best way to hide extraordinary abilities wasn't to work alone. It was to work with extraordinary people who made everyone around them better. The flight attendant who'd saved 300 lives had learned something that Phoenix the spy had never understood. The most powerful person in any situation wasn't the one with the most impressive credentials or the highest clearance level. It was the one who knew how to make everyone else more capable, more confident, and more willing to do whatever it took to bring everyone home safely. Whether that home was at the end of a commercial flight or at the conclusion of a mission that officially never happened, the principle was the same. Every person mattered, every skill had value, and the most important qualification anyone could have was the wisdom to never underestimate the people standing right beside them. Even if those people were wearing uniforms that suggested they were just flight attendants, janitors, or any of the countless other roles that kept the world running smoothly. Sometimes, especially then. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoyed this story about hidden expertise, the value of every crew member, and the extraordinary people working in ordinary jobs around us, please subscribe for more tales of heroes who don't wear capes. They wear uniforms, and they're probably closer than you think.